So good evening, everybody. Welcome to our launch of our Visualisation Institute, newly formed. We're very excited to have you here after so many delays, COVID delays, but finally we're all here to celebrate. I'm Linda Matthews, the co-director of the Visualisation Institute, and Andrew Johnson is my co-director. I'd also like to introduce you to our panellists for this evening, Michela Ledwidge, Elisa, Jonathan Knapp and Ian Opperman. Thank you for speaking tonight. But before we proceed, I'll run you through the agenda for tonight. So, first of all, Professor Elizabeth Mossop, the Dean of our Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building, will give the acknowledgement of country and an introductory welcome. Andrew and I will then give an overview of selected Visualisation Institute projects, and this will be followed by panellist presentations and a panel discussion, which is also open to audience Q&A. And last but not least, we will have some refreshments. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners and the knowledge keepers of the land on which UTS stands, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Tonight, we meet at a moment of renewed hope as we begin the process of moving towards an implementation of a voice to Parliament. As Linda has said, I'm the Dean of Design, Architecture and Building, and it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you to UTS and to the long-awaited launch of our Visualisation Institute. The Institute's a collaboration between the Faculty of Engineering and IT and the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building, and it operates across all of the university's disciplines and also beyond. The Institute facilitates research, innovation and education in all aspects of visualisation, and is emblematic of this university's ability to bring together emerging technologies with creative exploration, cultural insights, and innovative industries. Over the next 90 minutes, you're going to get a taste of what is possible and a sense of the Institute's ambition. And we hope that you will share our excitement about the future and already be thinking of ways that we can work together in this space. So without further ado, over to Andrew.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. We'd just like to show you a few examples of some of the work of the Visualisation Institute to give you a flavour of what we do. So, who are we? This is a probably incomprehensible diagram, but it gives you a flavour of some of the research groups and labs at UTS that are in some way concerned with visualisation. What we show here is that we draw on the full range of facilities and expertise at UTS to explore visualisation in the broadest sense. It's not just about graphs on the screen, but exploring how best to translate data into something we can perceive and interact with in a meaningful way. And also, by the way, we're very concerned with how we translate things we perceive into data, which the two go hand in hand. So I won't read the full laundry list of areas that we're kind of operating in, but these are some of them. Again, as you can see, we have expertise in technical areas like computer vision, graphics, and 3D game engines, for example. But just as importantly, we're concerned with narrative, storytelling, interaction design, games, and creativity. We're all about exploring new forms of data representation, and how we can make use of new technologies to create new experiences and generate insights. Being part of UTS means that we have access to lots of toys, lots of world-class facilities that open up all kinds of interesting possibilities for us. These include the UTS Data Arena, which is just over the road in Building 11 in the Faculty of Engineering and IT. And this is a 360-degree 3D immersive data visualization facility. The data arena features a full motion capture setup, 16-channel audio, and importantly, has a staff of experts who know how to wrangle all this tech and wrangle data from the raw form into something interactive, polished, and immersive. We also have access to a range of other cool technologies at the UTS Tech Lab, for example, in botany. This includes acoustic setups that allow the design and testing of novel approaches to immersive audio. In fact, one of our recent projects is a collaboration with Dolby Australia, looking at headphone-based spatial audio and game engines, and how this can bring new levels of immersion to players. And coupled with that, we're also looking at how spatial audio can enhance data visualizations by providing another mode of data representation. The UTS Animal Logic Academy, which I'm hoping a number of you have already heard of, is a core part of the Visualisation Institute, and it's a unique purpose-built animation and visual effects studio here at UTS. It's created in partnership with industry leaders Animal Logic, and this facility runs a one-year intensive master's course in which students work full-time from January through to December in a real-world studio environment. The Animal Logic Academy produces award-winning animations, but also develops innovative projects drawing on technologies like augmented and virtual reality, virtual production, and more. The UTS Fabrication Lab provides us with the ability to make data tangible and physical, and therefore enable new forms of storytelling, data exploration, and creative expression. For example, in this video, we can see, or you will see, a large fabrication lab industrial robot being used to shoot video footage of a handcrafted miniature film set. And this footage was used in the creation of a series of animations for the Australian Air Force, which had a completely distinctive aesthetic. And these animations support an outreach program that encourages young girls to consider careers in the aviation industry. And it also shows them, the making of, in a way, shows them how technology such as this can be used for creative expression and to explore new areas. Sorry, now Linda and I are going to swap.
We're
swapping projects.
Can I have the...
You can have the clicker.
Thank you. Okay, so James's work forms part of the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Buildings capability. James Melsom is a practicing landscape architect and a senior lecturer in the School of Architecture here at UTS. As co-founder of the research laboratory Landscape with Ilmar Herkskens, he's worked on international landscape scanning research and analysis projects. The work is a hybrid of remote sensing, aerial and terrestrial scanning, combining sensors with dynamic landscape transformation and projection. The video shown here is a selection of principally aerial research that has been collected in Australia and worldwide.
This project with Retriever Communications, who are creators of market-leading field service management software, explored the potential use of augmented reality by field technicians. This is people who work in repairing elevators or electricity substations, things like that. And we worked with them to explore the real-world experiences of field technicians as they went about their daily work. And we created a series of proof-of-concept augmented reality applications that showed workplace safety hazards to workers as they looked around a work site. It also enabled lift technicians, for example, to view detailed summaries of the work that had been done on certain pieces of equipment overlaid on the equipment itself.
Adrift is another project from the Faculty of Design, Architecture and Building. Adrift is an experimental online visualisation tool that allows citizen scientists without technical or scientific training to access, analyse and collect data about marine microbes. This creates more accessible and meaningful visual languages to explore and communicate complex, urgent scientific data and its implications for the future of the planet. The project is a collaboration between the Climate Change Cluster and the School of Design here at UTS, together with the Centre for Science Communication at the University of Otago. Adrift is generously funded by the Inspiring Australia Science Engagement Program, an initiative of the Australian Government Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, and supported by our partners, the Bureau of Meteorology and Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System.
Well done on saying meteorology as well. That's good.
I managed it this time.
Yeah. We also have a number of projects underway in the area of gamification, that is using games and game mechanics to enhance learning and engagement with complex data. The UTS Game Studio has expertise in bringing playability to complex visualisation and behavioural change projects. This includes games that encourage regular physical activity and exercise, and games that help reduce the chance that elderly people will experience a fall, for example. More recently, we've been working with Gravity iLabs to develop innovative game experiences that help communicate and explore an organisation's operational structure and strategy as well.
Thank you. And finally, from the Design and Architecture faculty and building, decoding the architectural genome. It's an ongoing project developed by Mohammed Maki, a senior lecturer and researcher in the School of Architecture at UTS, and standing over there at the back. Yes. The work translates the components that define architectural form into an architectural genome, using genetics and evolutionary biology knowledge to decode and extract emergent patterns that have always gone unnoticed. Key to this process is visualising data that is understandable by non-experts in the field, and the development of a visualisation technique that allows us to identify behaviours buried deep in the newly created data sets.
Okay. So apologies for reading from a script for a lot of that, but if we didn't, we would never get through them. From seeing those projects, we hope at least you get a flavour of the kind of things that we do. There's many more projects that we could show, and we could talk about each one of those for an hour just in themselves. So hopefully it's given you an oversight of the broad spectrum of the diversity of our work. But now we'd like to make the session a little bit more, move towards making the session a little bit more interactive, and we'll start by introducing our keynote panellists. They're all experts who are exploring new forms of visualisation in their respective fields. First up, we'd like to welcome Ian Opperman, Chief Data Scientist of New South Wales. Ian is a digital economy thought leader, highly cited researcher and a regular speaker about big data, broadband-enabled services and the impact of technology on society. He's an associate industry professor in the Faculty of Engineering and IT at UTS, and he's also the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist, working with it in the Department of Customer Service. He chairs an 11-member New South Wales Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee that is advising the state government on how it should use this technology. And the committee will also develop a world-first AI assurance framework for government projects. He also chairs the New South Wales Smart Places Advisory Council, a group which is supporting New South Wales to bring to life real-world projects that will drive the state's Smart Places agenda. Ian has nearly 30 years' experience in the information and communication technology sector and has led large organisations that deliver products and services that have reached millions of people around the world. He's held senior management roles in Europe and Australia, including Director for Radio Access Performance at Nokia, Global Head of Sales Partnering at Nokia Siemens Networks, and Division Chief and Flagship Director at CSIRO. So, Ian, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Let me also pay my respects to the traditional Aboriginal custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and extend that respect to elders past, present and emerging. Andrew just read out my bio, which is great. That gives me a little context to talk to you about some of the visualisations I thought I'd present tonight, or at least discuss tonight. I cannot tell you how much I was not looking forward to this presentation. I thought opening of a visualisation institute, where I'm pretty proud of my slides and the pretty pictures I put up, but I thought the bar is going to be raised very high tonight. So I thought I'd cheat. I thought the best thing I can do is actually borrow from people I have respected over the course of at least part of my career. I'm originally a telecoms guy. My PhD was on, wait for it, complex valued spreading sequences with a wide range of correlation properties. I typically couldn't get to the end of that title before people would fall off their chairs and fall asleep. But the visualizations were really good. The visualizations really got people excited. And I realized that part of what you need to do to effectively get the tech across is to find a really compelling way for people to access that information. So I've produced lots of things that my less kind colleagues used to call fly poop diagrams, which were just maps of these spreading sequences and how they interacted with each other. When I worked at Nokia Networks, the part of Nokia that's still around, we spent a lot of time producing pretty pictures of radio access coverage and where the services could be delivered based on the availability of that coverage. It used to be with GSM, you got coverage, you got capacity. As 3G came and 4G came, it changed. Where you got coverage didn't mean the same thing as capacity, so we had to find different ways of visualizing. We also realized that physics starts to break down when you've got really complex systems, so the best thing to do was just put some coverage out there, put some capacity out there, suck all the data in, draw those pretty pictures again, and then do the optimization. I came back to Australia and joined the CSIRO as the director of the ICT Centre, and came across part of the team with a group of guys building something which was in the early days of simultaneous localization and mapping, something called Zebedee. And looking around, some of you will remember the magic roundabout and Zebedee, the thing on a spring. These folks developed a LiDAR system which literally was on a spring, and they would wander around producing point clouds of whatever they came across with incredible precision and with incredibly low complexity. This is one of those pictures. This is a forest. Wandering around in the forest, those little coloured lines are actually the operator walking around in the forest, looking a bit suspicious, I have to tell you, and producing a point cloud of that forest and then mapped to a sphere. So it's just a lovely animation. And it's very, very early days. This is about 2010, 2011. But the precision was amazing. It was under a centimetre, around about 7 millimetres. The amount of data that was generated was phenomenal, and then the ability to map it was really quite amazing. Very, very low processing and early stage use of cloud computing. These guys went on to produce some really amazing things, including being able to walk into meeting rooms, this is Questacon, wandering around, in some cases, two of them wandering around and mapping the building during the coffee break. And they also did some pretty interesting stuff. They assured me this was work. They flew to Italy, went to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and I'm told that somewhere between 12 minutes and 20 minutes running up and down the stairs, they produced the first ever interior map of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The reason they don't quite know how much time it took was because apparently there was a security guard chasing them from about halfway through that process. But they did still stop to put their Zebedee out the window and wave it around so they can get some of the exterior of the building as well. Again, amazing precision. If you're interested in looking about more of the images that Zebedee has captured over the years, you can go to the website that's research.csiro/robotics/Zebedee, and it is just amazing. Such low complexity ways of capturing the physical world around us. Mix that in with photogrammetry, you start to produce some of those images that we saw earlier on. But this was very, very early on. The other point, of course, about visualization is you can really tell a story. It's not just about fun. You can really tell a story. And this is something that I thought, again, in my trepidation about coming to tonight, that I thought I'd play back something from very early 2020. And this was the World Economic Forum and their view of how big a deal is this COVID thing. And the story that they were telling was that we've had plagues and pandemics throughout human history. And we've had things, we record things right back to the age of the plague of Justinian, which was around the 6th century. And that killed a lot of people, it infected a lot of people, it killed a lot of people. We then had a series of other plagues, including bubonic plague, which I found out recently is about 10,000 years old as a pathogen. It's been evolving since then. That took out somewhere between 30% and 60% of populations in Western Europe. Really quite an amazing pathogen with global impact. And then, of course, there's that little COVID thing, which you can probably just see down the very front, the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, 4.7 thousand cases and a couple of deaths. And the argument was, this is not a big deal. And I remember my colleague putting this forward to me and saying, no biggie. Here is the World Economic Forum saying this is not a big deal. Every single day in New South Wales, I analyse the COVID data before it goes out, the confirmed cases and the testing cases. I stopped counting the individual number of cases some time ago, but we hit 1 million cases, 1 million confirmed cases around about towards the latter end of 2021. We hit 2 million cases, confirmed cases, December 10th last year, and today it was something like 2.447 million cases, give or take a few. And just for us, it's a big deal. So the moral of this story is that's a very compelling image, that's a very compelling visualisation, but it's fundamentally wrong. And the bias of the person presenting that story, their own perspective, has fundamentally changed what was otherwise a really good visualisation of some pretty hardcore data into something which is actually very, very misleading. Something now switching to what I've been doing over the last few years with New South Wales Government around data visualisations. I said once upon a time I painted pretty pictures of cell coverage. We were tasked, when I was running the Data Analytics Centre, we were tasked to look at the issue of external electronic defibrillators and where people have out-of-hospital cardiac arrests, and if we would be better off putting more defibrillators into areas like sporting environments, or having fire and rescue be co-first responders if you're having an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, or whether or not we should spend money on other things rather than, we should train people to use the defibrillators that are there and spend money on other things as well instead of, more defibrillators. So we thought, this is not an argument that we're going to win or we're going to solve, but it's an argument we can make sure is better data informed. So I borrowed some of my network communications thinking and said, where do people have out-of-hospital cardiac arrests? Where are they found alive? Where are they found dead? And where are the defibrillators? Now, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest is a pretty serious issue in Australia, around about 30,000 a year. Your chance of surviving if you are reached and defibrillated within 5 minutes is 10%. Your chance of surviving if you are reached and defibrillated within 10 minutes is conveniently 5%. And then it drops off pretty dramatically after that. But people do survive, and therefore we know that defibrillators make sense. So we said, let's plot where people have had out-of-hospital cardiac arrests. Let's plot where the defibrillators are. Let's also explore what would happen if fire and rescue were given defibrillators. They do carry them, but if they were co-first respondents. And let's also look at if we started to place defibrillators in different areas near ATMs or in service stations or in pharmacies, what that coverage might look like. So these are some isochrones around the location of defibrillators. And you can see that people having out-of-hospital cardiac arrests are in red, and the emergency services locations are in blue, and just how far you can get in 5 minutes, or in 7.5 minutes, or in 10 minutes. And clearly there are some places where you have no chance. And this is regional New South Wales, this is not Sydney. By the way, there's a lot of defibrillators around the university, so feel very comforted. The trick is whether or not people will actually use them. And this led to a really, really, really significant argument. But at least the argument was, what are the principles that we're looking to achieve? What are the outcomes we're looking to achieve? And are we getting close to being able to deliver on those outcomes once we agree on them? And I promise you, it was a very, 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 very significant argument between the different providers or the different potential providers, but their arguments were now much more squarely based on the use of data. Didn't make us any friends at all, because everyone had a common enemy that they could point to and say, it's these guys' fault, they gave us the data. I also mentioned that, that some of the data visualisations can tell a story. This is the first ever visualisation of the experience, or at least the contact points, for children identified at risk of significant harm. When I came into the role, there was a review done of out-of-home care, so children identified at risk of significant harm, at ROSH, taken from their families, put into some sort of protective environment. And the system had 22,000 children, was costing the state $1 billion a year, and the outcomes were very bad. And an external review said the system needs reform, and it needs to be reformed based on data. We produced life journeys for every single child over the last 10 years in out-of-home care, so 22,000 at the time, 44,000 over 10 years. And we looked at the experience that they had and their entry points into out-of-home care, and then the interactions they had. And typically you get identified at risk of harm or at risk of significant harm through police, through health, or through Department of Education. And we looked at the relative experience of every single one of those children over the course of the first phases of their contact with out-of-home care. And this really shocked people, because now we could say it's not 80% of children have the experience that the system was planned for. 20% have some sort of complex interaction. A small fraction of those have a really complex interaction. We could say, this child, this is the experience of this child, and this is the experience of this sort of child, girls under 12, regional remote, boys over 12, regional remote. And that, again, was a really, really powerful way of understanding the problem, which could have been overlaid with a story. But one of the things we learnt very early on is to say is, not why. This is the situation. This is our level of confidence in the situation, rather than saying why it's a situation. We did something similar around the sorts of services a child would have contact with, and that would lead to out-of-home care. That lead to be identified at risk of significant harm. And this was really, really experimental stuff at the time, 2016, 2017. And again, it really changed the way people believed they could think about the challenges, these big social challenges that we had with out-of-home care. It didn't necessarily make, in fact, anybody happy at all, because there are, again, some challenges. Once you start to know things, once you start to see that level of specificity, then you've got an obligation to at least explore doing things differently. But the last one I wanted to leave you with is one of my favourites from my friend, Professor Brian Boyle, who was one of the early lead proponents of the Square Kilometre Array Pathfinder project out in Western Australia, the world's largest radio telescope, producing so much data that zettabytes is how they were describing what they were going to produce. They throw away 99.99% of the data after they've done some quick anomaly detection, and they are producing amazing images of our galaxy and our universe. Brian's an amateur astronomer and an amateur photographer of astronomy, and this is one of his amateur photographs looking at, I believe, the Statue of Liberty Nebula. And I thought, I'm never going to win against this sort of visualisation, so I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I'd like to introduce you now to our next panellist, Elisa Lee. I'll just wait for that to come up. Elisa Lee is a Sydney-based interaction designer and visual communicator. She is passionate about storytelling and inspiring conversation by creating new ways of generating and experiencing data. Elisa's visualisation project, Unstacked, showcases the collections of gallery, library, archival and museum institutions by visualising how a collection is accessed by the public in real time. Unstacked has been installed at the University of New South Wales Library, UTS Library, the State Library of New South Wales, the State Library of Queensland and the State Library of Victoria. Thank you, Elisa.
Good evening. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and future of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So at Unstacked, we have found that many institutions face similar challenges around awareness and visibility of their collections, as well as understanding of what an institution is and does. In addition, collections are growing both digitally and physically through new acquisitions and digitisation. However, in many cases, physical and screen space for display is becoming more limited, with only a small percentage of a collection being able to be visible at any one time. So in a time when online access and discovery has become more important than ever, due to location or circumstances of your patrons, Unstacked provides exposure to collections through an ongoing self-sustaining exhibition of a collection and how it is being used, curated entirely by the people who are using it. So when someone unearths an item from a catalogue, no matter where they are in the world, this object comes alive not just for that one person, but for everyone, exposing more of a collection to more people and allowing the institution to see and respond in real time to the interests of their patrons. Seems to be stuck on a loop. Here we go. So from Girl Guides to giant cane toads, protest rallies, and intriguing miniature portraits of children, Unstacked displays the diversity of interests of your patrons. You can also see how people are impacted by days of historical significance, for example on Anzac Day or Australia Day. Each of these are screenshots from activity, and they're like mini exhibitions curated accidentally by either the staff or the public. The project is called Unstacked because it presents in visual form items which are either physically or digitally coming from the stacks. As distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell said at the ALIA conference in 2019, we all remember taking the wrong way in the stacks and finding something gloriously unexpected. Unstacked allows everyone to wander through these stacks and to experience this serendipitous discovery through other people's research. We've had the pleasure of personalising Unstacked to these following institutions and are currently in development with the State Library of South Australia as well as Flinders University Library. And whilst the projects I am showing here have been developed for libraries, the project has value for any institution with a collection. So I'd like to acknowledge that this project was co-concepted and developed with a very creative technologist, Adam Hinshaw. And our journey started with an artist in residency at UTS, where we visualised the underground robotic storage and retrieval system. And it then continued when our Unstacked proposal was accepted by the State Library of New South Wales DX Lab. Now a short video so you can hear directly from a library.
It's been incredible to see not only the public but also staff be so engaged and excited about seeing all their work visualised in that way and the public response to it. To be able to see how people are surprised and delighted by what we have in our collection and then go on their journey in terms of their research or their creative or their personal endeavours has been incredibly inspiring.
To see in real time what people are actually searching for this very moment we're standing here and what they're chasing is well, it's a completely kind of riveting experience to do, and it just opens up the breadth of basically the collection, but also the breadth of humanity in some way.
So, how does it work? When someone accesses a collection item from an online catalogue, it simply appears in Unstacked with a short delay of up to 1 minute. So views might be coming from someone selecting an item from a search results list or from a direct link. The item animates on, and items previously looked at shuffle further along. If an image is associated with the record, we show the image, and if it doesn't have an image, we represent it through typography and colour. A really common query we have is around privacy, but the data we are using is data the institution already gathers, and it has no link to an individual. So Unstacked is a living, breathing representation of interaction with the collection. So sometimes there is a rush of movement when there is high activity, and at other times a contemplative pause. It visualises the heartbeat of an organisation, and in the case of UNSW Library, the heartbeat of the university, as research activities across the institution are revealed. Unstacked promotes conversation and highlights the collection and how people are using it. As the invisible is made visible, patrons are exposed to the richness and diversity of the collection through other people's research. So this is helpful in a time when what we're exposed to can be limited to what algorithms believe we are interested in, shutting off a potential treasure chest of new things to explore. I'll now talk about UNSW. So in 2019, UNSW, just like UTS Library in 2014, was moving print collections off-site to create more diverse spaces, which created a challenge in terms of user perception of the library. The library asked themselves, what does it mean for our collections not to be visible, or as visible as before? A research project the library undertook identified issues around user perception, so they conceived a project that would address these, as well as the recurring sentiment, "I don't go to the library." Their objectives were to create an artwork as well as a clear communication piece that would give visibility to the digital library and make visible the invisible online interaction in the library that they knew was happening 24 hours a day. So this is where Unstacked was engaged. UNSW Library presented a unique opportunity to visualise the scope and use of an academic collection, so different to state library collections. It was vital that students could see themselves in Unstacked to feel connected to the library and the university, and workshops with students and staff and user testing allowed us to feel confident that we were achieving this. I now take you through the project. So what you're looking at here is a real-time view of how the library is being used, as well as the culmination of activity in the library over the course of the day. So we can see by that orange tile that just flew in and landed on business, that somebody just looked at something from business, and it did a little dance to celebrate that. We just show select titles, as with up to 28,000 views a day. To show them all in the way where we highlight them is just, there's too many, which is a really wonderful problem to have. So instead, we have a form of a library stenographer in the background who is recording the title of every item being viewed. Statistical narratives are pulled out, such as the most popular item from a particular discipline and total items viewed this year. And by showing a running title of items viewed per discipline per day, we are in a way gamifying library usage, with students being invested in how their own faculty is going. So, did it work? On the screen is some fantastic feedback we had from Professor Andrew Lynch, the Dean of Law, that really showcases the outcome UNSW Library was hoping for. Our aim from the beginning was for this visualisation to shift existing perceptions, and the students delighted us by sharing with us that it did just that. And finally, Unstacked has had a powerful impact on the library itself because it's given them an intimate and ever-present connection to how people are accessing their collections. Because of Unstacked during NAIDOC, they noticed that the most viewed item that day was the documentary In My Blood It Runs. They could reflect this back to the community about how they were using the collection and amplify their voice. As the library said, it is a much more powerful message because it's real, and Unstacked could tell us that it was happening in that moment. So, integral to our process is a scoping phase where we work with the institution to understand their strategic goals and objectives and the day-to-day intricacies of their business. It doesn't matter how large or small their collection is, how many image resources it contains, whether or not they have 30,000 views a day or only 500. There's always a story to tell. And through this story, they can build awareness of their organisation, showcase its value, and help to shape engagement by bringing their resources to the light and exposing what is available but which we might not see. It's been really encouraging to see how valued collections have been during the pandemic through Unstacked. So while the doors may be shut at times, it's really evident through seeing activity that no matter the challenges, patrons are still very much engaged. And for us, it's clear that collections are cherished and it's a privilege to be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisa. So Jonathan Knapp is our next presenter. Jonathan is a Director of SJB Urban with qualifications and professional experience in urban design, architecture and town planning. Jonathan has worked in several multidisciplinary design practices internationally. He has led town and city centre regeneration projects throughout London and the UK, zero carbon communities in Canada, and concept design for mixed-use schemes in Turkey and Eastern Europe. In early 2011, Jonathan established SJB Urban in Sydney. The practice specialises in urban design and regeneration projects and sits alongside SJB's architecture, planning and interior studios in Sydney and Melbourne. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Linda. I'd like to start as well by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the new brand. It's very bright, so I'll skip to the next slide. Thanks, Frankie. When Linda and Mohammed asked me to come along tonight to give a 10-minute presentation, I wasn't quite sure I was getting myself in for, but it's been great to go number 3 and see 2 great talks before me and know probably the contrasts about what I'm about to present. As an urban designer, working in private practice for over 20 years, I suppose our world is around describing cities and suburbs and how they change, but also working within an industry that is aspirational through university, but notoriously binary when it comes to private practice in the way that we express our work. We still print our books for design competitions, we still draw by hand, and we're still grappling with the future of visualisation, and certainly some of the projects being shown tonight is incredibly ambitious and inspiring for us. And we're working with Mohammed and Linda about how we can better use the data and skills available to talk about our work and describe the challenges that we're facing in our cities. So working within SJB, we are a town planning, interior design and architecture practice and urban design. We've got the urban design team here tonight as well, so thanks for coming along to support me, guys. And very rarely do all of our areas of expertise to come together. And this is a project we've just recently completed up in Newcastle. It's taken 10 years to realise, and I suppose that embodies the time frames that we must manage in our work. And I would say that during those 10-year period, the way that we talk about our work and the possibilities of visualising the change that we're facing in our cities has drastically accelerated. And that's largely because of the people that I work with. It's well and truly beyond my skill set. I see the potential, but certainly the next cohort of professionals coming out of university have the skills and capability to bring some of these ideas to life. And so when I think about visualisation, I keep on returning back to this quote, which a barrister told me in a court case once, and the scepticism that they face when we talk about our work as architects and urbanists, when we describe the city and we describe our work. Because the reality is that architectural visualisation is now at such a level where it is photorealistic. We are now designing our projects through visualisations and delivering them on site almost to the grain of marble. And this is a scary realisation in some regards, but also incredibly empowering. It's also well beyond my capability. But this is a display suite on the left-hand side, visualised, and a display suite delivered for the purposes of selling. And I suppose this highlights the realities of our profession, that ultimately the end user, whether it be the person buying the unit, the developer realising their vision, or a council delivering their policy, needs to understand what we're talking about. 5 years ago, we didn't do images like this. They're incredibly clunky, onerous and expensive, whereas today it is part of the way that we do our work. We do design competitions almost monthly, and it is a scary thing when we go to site to take a photo of the finished product and realise how close it is to the original competition-winning image. Scary in some regards, but I suppose empowering in others. But you can see here that over a 5-year period, from competition winning to delivery, the fruits of the labour, but also the skill of visualisation, artist and the architect who's fulfilled that vision. It's also part of an approval process. We do our work, we design our work, we need to get somebody to approve it. And so our audience is also the approval authorities. It's not sexy, but the council, staff, the government organisations, the bureaucrats who sit across the table, they're the ones who do give us the go-ahead to help realise our vision. And this is a recently completed project, the Young and Loftus precinct next to the AMP Tower down at Circular Quay. Again, a 10-year proposition from very early planning and massing to the realisation of the project. These things always seem to happen in decade lumps. And then lastly, more the realm that we work in, which is selling the dream, repositioning a city, in this instance on the banks of the mighty Georges River opposite Liverpool CBD, expanding a CBD and reinforcing the idea of a third CBD for Sydney other than the Aerotropolis. And again, a project we've been working on for 8 years. We have another member of the team here tonight. And here we are, again, being ambitious in our ideas, communicating the aspiration of a client and the potential for a river foreshore. But what this doesn't talk about is really all the stuff that happens beyond the buildings themselves. And that's really where I'm most interested in the future of visualising our work, and that's what really sits at the bedrock of our research with Linda and Mohammed, and Jordan's here tonight from SJB, who's leading that side. So it's really beyond the building that things get a bit more interesting, and I don't want this to turn into a university lecture, but I will start with where it all began for me, and the diagram on the left-hand side, which some of you might recognise, but it's how we used to talk about cities and suburbs. Going back to our good friend Ebenezer Howard, we get told about Ebenezer, a UK town planner from the early 20th century, and here's a diagram for the Garden City, and you can start to see the similarities with places like Canberra, with this idea of a tight urban core surrounded by green fields. And really Greater London is the embodiment of the ultimate garden city surrounded by its green belt. But in any case, these are the types of diagrams, and this is the theoretical framework that we are taught as students. It lacks any richness, it is incredibly simple, it is black and white, and it really, if you look out the windows of this beautiful building and see the life of the city, it ignores all of that. It takes it down to simple metrics. But it's really Jane Jacobs that came along in the 1960s, a journalist and sociologist and observer of the city, who, I suppose, shone the light on the complex natures of our city and the value of downtown, particularly her part of Manhattan, which she saw being eroded through large infrastructure and engineering and house building projects. But her work is still held up as a cornerstone for urban design and city thinking, and it's really built on by other great pieces of work like Yangel's piece of work from 1970, and of course he's left his fingerprint on Sydney through the reimagining of George Street. That's on the back of a piece of work he did about 10 years ago. So from the very early days of this very simplistic diagram about how we design our cities and suburbs to a much richer understanding about what makes cities unique and special. The difficulty is, how do we communicate the latter part of that discussion? Even in my education in the 1990s, we were still relying on these really simplistic diagrams which ignored the complex relationships of environment, of social fabric, and of character and place and what makes things unique. And these diagrams are extracted from another important piece of I suppose policy making. Is called Towards an Urban Renaissance. It was put out in 1997. Richard Rogers was involved, the late great Richard Rogers, and it was done as, I suppose, a piece of work to reposition Greater London. It was coming out of a big economic slump, and they're looking to, I suppose, place London as an economic powerhouse and a service centre. Canary Wharf, I suppose, is the embodiment of that, for better or for worse, but the expansion of the underground system really sort of built upon these principles. But you can see on the right-hand side, our friend Ebenezer Howard's legacy continues on. And whilst it was a really good piece of policy making, it certainly lacked, I suppose, the depth of understanding about what made London so great and so unique, and the assumption that it needed to have a renaissance in the first place. And then, I suppose, we've grappled in the early noughties with how to harness data sets and information to describe the richness of a cityscape, and particularly public spaces. And it's really sort of broken down into two polar ends of the discussion. It's either incredibly qualitative, graphic, simple, and accessible, but sort of lacking any sort of meaning and depth, or it's on the right-hand side, this space syntax, very early iterations about traffic and pedestrian movement in Greater London, this sort of beautiful but quite overwhelming diagram, which is almost incredibly difficult to or impossible to access and interpret. And that's really where the industry has sort of flirted for the last sort of 20 years of my career. You're either on the left-hand side trying to talk about density in a simplistic, accessible and qualitative way. In this instance, again, an extract from Towards an Urban Renaissance. This diagram has been reproduced millions of times by urbanists around the world, describing what 75 dwellings per hectare looks like, if you're interested. Or on the right-hand side, getting enormous data sets to describe variations in population density for major cities around the world. But again, you can see Greater London in the top right-hand corner, a sort of nice low spread of medium density as compared to other sort of hyper-dense cities around the world. All very interesting, but it's kind of telling us what we already know. I mean, you could look at the top diagram, not knowing that was London, and if you're in the profession, you'd probably join the dots and work out which one was which. Similarly with Mumbai or Hong Kong. Hong Kong in particular, incredible density on a postage stamp of a city. So I'm going to use density as an example because it's been something which we grapple with as a profession and I suppose as a city, and quite often density is a dirty word. People think it equates to erosion of services or their own personal freedoms, but I suppose in our mind density isn't a dirty word if it's done well. That's Frankie's favourite phrase, density done well. You know, and we are getting more dense, so it's a question that's not going to go away. We need to try and find a solution and talk about it in a more productive manner. And this goes back to some very, very early research for Mohammed and Linda that we did for a linkage grant with RMIT probably about 10, 12 years ago. And with these, I suppose, still quite confusing diagrams, trying to understand the relationship between housing typology and the density. And again, there's probably nothing there that we don't already know. When you have apartments, it is more dense, okay? But what's more interesting is what does density bring us? In this instance, again, a very simplistic diagram, but underneath it was some data that we managed to get in a very, very clunky way through ABS, through other sources, using Excel spreadsheets to try and work out what density brings. And this here is about access to other services, whether it be schools or local centres, community centres, train stations. And it's trying to find the correlation between the positive outcomes of density and, I suppose, the negative stigma that often goes along with it. And this was to combat, at the time, the perception that affordability is only ever found on the fringe of a city. But the trade-off when you go to the fringe of the city is that you lack the access to services. You also need 2 cars, you've got to drive for longer, there's an enormous opportunity cost, you're spending a lot on tolls, you're spending a lot on petrol, you spend less time with your family, housing stress, so on and so forth. And so it was, I suppose, a decision-making tool that we put forward as a proposition, and rather than the industry embracing it, realestate.com embraced it, Westpac embraced it for mortgage and lending. So it wasn't quite where we wanted to go. I sort of lost interest, and I went back to my day job of doing urban design. But in any case, what we found, particularly in the last couple of years, that the state government has been very interested in density and what it means because they're building a lot of infrastructure. They're spending billions and billions on new metros, on train line extensions and roads, but we're less interested in roads, more interested in metro. And they were trying to understand what is the optimal density to be placing around these new pieces of infrastructure. Frankie will know this is all very familiar. This is research from about 5 or 6 years ago for the Department of Planning, which looked pretty simple, looking at different dwellings per hectare around different centres, both existing and emerging. But what they also were interested in, thankfully, was what else went along with the density. And it goes back to that earlier piece of research that I showed, albeit with some clunky graphics. But it's about access to open space, what is the range of uses, what are the other transport modes available, how big was the area that we're talking about, so on and so forth. And very, very slowly we started to get into different data sets. But ultimately, when we started to talk about this work, it still came back to this very qualitative, diagrammatic way. We found there was always a disconnect between a qualitative assessment by someone like me in the profession and the cold, hard data that we're able to access. And we unfortunately haven't got the same cool toys that UTS has. We haven't got the computer rooms, we haven't got the data sets. We can only get what we can get. And so we are limited by somewhat the data, but also our capacity as practitioners. And so it was only when Jordan joined us about 2 years ago, and the conversation moved from density and came to something a bit more esoteric like character. Yes, the community was very interested in, the government was very interested in what character meant. And again, that's a bit of a strange one. We're trying to describe the character of a place. But if you go back to the early research of Jane Jacobs, that's essentially what she was talking about, that these parts of Manhattan that were being knocked over for motorways and housing projects had a character that was unique and that was valued, had a community fabric there that was special, and it was being lost. And if you created a new development, you're never going to recreate the same character and fabric that had been there before. And so through a piece of research and I suppose some very clever modelling by Jordan, he was able to tap into a much greater range of data sets from a range of different sources, and he's able to start to map and synthesise that information to describe what the unique characteristics of this part of Sydney was. This is up on the North Shore. Not to say that that was a particularly special place, but it was a council that were being very ambitious and put the challenge to us. And so I suppose through that lens, we're starting to wrestle with how we can use these data sets to describe the things that we've been talking about as a profession for generations but haven't been able to articulate. It's usually a person's opinion, it's either an overwhelming diagram or it's a very simplistic graphic. And so when I think of what's next, I suppose it's probably a bit of a précis for Mohammed and Linda about what we're going to be trying to do over the next sort of 6 months to a year, is think about the way that we can engage more broadly to gather information. What we found through our character research is what it lacked was the personal interface. Without going to community consultation, which we so often do, how do we get an appreciation of what an individual or what the community thinks about a particular space? Thankfully, we now have all phones in our pockets, and if we can use them a lot better as part of our profession, we can tap into that personal perspective about what makes these places special to them. Because who am I as a professional going to a place like Newcastle and telling them what is great about their city? The people, the Novocastrians themselves should be the ones telling me. And so what we're doing is we're trying to play with ideas of understanding the concepts of time using tools like augmented reality. Again, it's something we've flirted with through architecture, through design competitions. It's always incredibly clunky. It's not very well received. But the technology is improving and the way that we can show the transition and the change of this particular view or part of the city over time. And you can see the image in the middle is when we first went to Newcastle to do a project, and then on the back of some pretty substantial state government investment, they removed the Queen Elizabeth Bridge, which has got a very phallic symbol in the middle of it, to recreate this connection back to the water. And unless you were there at that time, you wouldn't appreciate the importance of that single move in the city and the importance and the contribution that it makes to the future of Newcastle. The other one is about how we engage. And again, these are screen grabs from something I asked Jordan to do one afternoon as part of a bid. Again, without that bid, without Jordan, I'd never be able to, I suppose, show you these. And this is very simple form. Jordan's probably embarrassed by what he did, or I hope he's proud, but I know what he's capable of doing. But this is creating, I suppose, a web platform where the community could go and engage with the planning process. And strategic planning is important because it really shapes the future of our city. It's also something which no one ever engages with as the common man because it's incredibly complicated and it's usually at such a high level and a little bit too vague. It's hard to really hang your hat on it. People engage with town planning when their house is being impacted by overshadowing, when someone's building on a local park, or the traffic gets worse at a junction. When people try to talk about the future of a city over the next 30 years, it's a very difficult concept to wrap your head around unless you're in the profession. And so with these online platforms, we're playing with ideas about how changes in density, changes in land use will change the form and function of their city. We put this to the City of Sydney. They didn't choose us, but we're not going to give up. We still think this is a really valuable way of engaging with the broader community to talk about the future of our cities. And lastly, it's try to look at existing technologies and platforms that are in the market but aren't catered to the architectural or planning industry. This is a website, an app called Augmented City, where you essentially go around, you take a picture, you talk about how you can make it better, you visualise that and you add comments. And really crudely, it's this type of information. It's about how you can go take a picture of a city, this is what I like, It's almost like a more in-depth version of Instagram. Linda, I sort of joked to Linda that there was once a time you could access the Instagram data sets and use that as a way of trying to understand who's taking what photos where. And whilst that might sound incredibly superficial and might have, I suppose, a perception of everyone doing selfies, something so simple as where people are taking Instagram photos does reflect how people interpret and value a particular place. Even if it is self-serving and a little bit narcissistic, you can still get an appreciation about what parts of the city are important. And with a bit of in-depth looking, you can probably understand the reasons why. And I suppose these other platforms are alternate and more direct ways of engaging with that same sensibility, using the phone that we all have in our pockets to understand how people value their cities and particular spaces within them. So I want to say thank you very much to Mohammed and Linda for inviting me tonight. I hope you guys found that somewhat disjointed but somewhat valuable as well, and I look forward to the session afterwards. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. And you mentioned that you don't have access to the cool toys that we have access to, but actually because you work with us, you do now. Okay. So, last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Michela Ledwidge. Michela is a director who specialises in real-time and virtual production. She's both creative and technical lead on most of her productions. She's acknowledged as a pioneer for her award-winning remixable approach to film architecture, which has led to high-profile, cutting-edge projects on 3 continents since creating the first website in New South Wales in 1993, which is quite a milestone. During the .com and Web 2.0 years, she worked on a large variety of corporate, startup and indie projects, e.g. with, for example, the BBC and Reuters, through her consultancy, thequality.com, culminating in founding Mod Films in London in 2004, with Invention Award funding from the UK National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. In 2010, Michela co-founded Mod Productions in Sydney to form a more commercially viable indie studio that today is simply called Mod and focuses on real-time and virtual production. She has served as Vice President Digital of the Australian Directors Guild and was a co-founder of the Sydney Unity Users Group and Women in AR and VR Sydney. So, welcome, Michela.
Mad Films, I like that one. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. In 1996, I was working in Redfern, in the old Redfern Electric Light Station building, just around the corner from where Koori Radio is today. I was working for Next Online, which I think was the first web agency in the country, and our web traffic was going through the roof. Exponential growth. Everyone was getting really excited. This Web 1 thing was taking off. But the biggest jump in traffic in Australia wasn't from people. It was from spiders. And us devs, we could see that, but that's not how the story was being communicated in sales and in the press, because we all massaged the data for our own purposes. And on it goes. Decades later, I'm still part of this global effort to massage, mine, analyse and share works that pop out of this amazing digital medium that we've created. And it is truly amazing. But it's also a right mess, one that's growing by the day. I'm an optimist, and there's plenty of work to do, but we're no way as empowered by technology as we could be. When it comes to visualisation, more can be less. Take 3D viz on 2D displays, for example. You don't typically see 3D interfaces unless you're watching Jurassic Park, for example, because we're learning more and more about what humans need to engage and extract meaning. But motivations for meaning vary. Did any of you see this chart during the election? Yeah, a few nods. Notice how the biggest slice of the pie is labelled with the smaller figure. Typo? I don't have the data to prove it, but apparently it was in News Corp's Herald Sun. All I have is the retweets. In 2012, this was state-of-the-art data visualisation in cinema. This is from Ridley Scott's Prometheus film, created in Newtown by Fuel VFX, long gone. In the same year, this is how state-of-the-art science was presented. amazing, world-changing discoveries. And yet, Twitter was more ablaze with scorn for the valid choice of fonts. We are simple beings. We're only human, messy, contradictory beings, not always empowered as we think we are. I'm still amazed that the squares in the bottom row of this picture are all the same colour. This is the Bartleson-Brenneman effect. We are easily, if you don't believe me, I can point you at Wikipedia and you can use Photoshop to sample the colour. Right? We are easily tricked by VES, whether it's deliberate or not. And the ramifications of being deliberately deceived by players in a global network are truly staggering. I'm deeply disturbed by the rise of Web3 blockchain schemes because of how effectively they exploit fear of missing out, glossy aspirations, and digital illiteracy. I can't visualise a worse technology stack for the real world of today. We can do better. Unfortunately, we will, because there's so many architectures and innovations out there, predating even old Web 1, that are still slowly coming to fruition after decades of research to become, well, practical magic. The rise of virtual production, where video game engines, motion capture techniques, holograms and more come together now as practical, creative tools for film and TV makers. The wonders of immersive, interactive experience, powered by real-time audio-visual engines with a never-ending sea of possibilities for creators and makers. The power of global distribution, expertly leveraged by acts today like K-pop sensation Blackpink that use every trick in the book to connect. The promise of telepresence for global collaboration. This is my first directing gig during COVID with comedy legend Harry Shearer, who's performing at home with his deepfake Donald Trump in LA, and this is the view from my laptop in Haymarket down the road. Clearer and clearer opportunities for blending the real and virtual through augmented reality interfaces. This is a pilot we did with ANU last year. We're not quite there yet, but watch the AR space. But ultimately, what is this all for? A few years ago, I set myself a deeply personal challenge. I took a polarising topic, for those of you who can't see the screen. It was a deep dive into public data on Australian anti-equality lobbying. And it was a topic that I thought could benefit from a bit of spatial visualisation. So I naively dove into the world of data journalism for the first time. The result was released last year as a VR documentary experience, and here's the trailer. Let's follow the money. Let's follow the money and see what we can find. My name is Michela Ledwidge. I'm an economy class trans woman running a small studio in Sydney, Australia. And I've been investigating another small business, the Australian Christian Lobby. There's 23 million Australians, and in the last census, about 61% of them identified as Christian. It does seem like Australians haven't had a problem with gay people marrying for about 10 years, maybe 7 years. So why has it taken so long for the laws to change? With marriage equality now firmly enshrined in law, the focus of ACL and the Conservative politicians has moved to trying to change laws to allow religious discrimination against LGBTQI people.
You've said you intend to look at protections for religious freedoms. Can you give me an example at the moment where people's religious freedoms are being impinged in Australia?
In the process of this investigation, I realised there is one point on which the ACL and I agree.
Decisions in politics are made by those who show up.
We can make a better world with real human connections. And let's go talk to people. Game on. So here I am talking to you. And this visualisation technique has only been released in the last couple of months. The data is still coming in on the benefits. But we're already working with some new data sets. We've started working with APNIC, who instead of having, say, 300 nodes on that project, we've now got 4.6 million nodes of how internet address space is allocated throughout the Asia-Pacific region. New challenges with that one. But one thing is really clear. We've really got to keep this VR data visualization concept simple. And fortunately, we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is the same data set that's powered through my VR visualization through a more traditional backend, the Neo4j Bloom tool, which is available to journalists. And for all the hype around VR possibilities, the real challenge we're facing is boiling things down to something as simple and as boring as PowerPoint. That's what we're working on. And it's really exciting. This is just a concept mock-up. It's not the reality today. But as you can imagine, we could create this exact snapshot in a VR experience with 5 3D nodes, but that's not the point. Imagine a general purpose tool that you can use for any of your data, your personal data that you would never want to put in the cloud. We're not quite there yet. But that's okay, because our approach is an artisan approach. It takes time to get things right. And I'm super excited and privileged to have a studio down the road that can work on story worlds and tools in tandem. You won't see any play-to-earn titles coming out of mod, but we love games that you can play for entertainment's sake. And there's plenty more polarising data stories to tell. We'll continue putting this internet thing also under the microscope and keep track of what makes it tick, which is you. Congrats to UTS and the launch of the Visualisation Institute, and thanks very much for inviting us to share it.
Thanks, Michela. It's a beautiful project. So now, finally, we've got to the interactive part of the evening. So we have 4 amazing panellists on the stage here that you've heard from, that I hope have given you some inspiration and seeded some interesting thoughts. So we have some people with microphones, I believe, who can pass them around. So can I just throw it open? Would anyone like to ask a question of the panel? Perhaps while you're mulling that over and getting up the courage, I could perhaps start by just asking the panel broadly, like in the really broad field of visualization, what is it that excites you the most? Is that a sufficiently broad question?
Just to crack the ice, the democratization of the tools. For example, the Neo4j system that we used for a clever label, I only found out about it because the International Consortium of Journalists won a Pulitzer Prize for the Panama Papers using this Neo4j thingy. It's like, ooh, that looks really interesting. And we were able to get a free startup license to use this tool that they charge 6 figures easily to corporates. A lot of the intelligence services around use it to track us, but small, independents and academics, researchers, students can use this for free. So I think that's exciting.
Yeah. Anyone? Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. I suppose what I'm excited about is the next generation and the generation after that. I suppose in my relatively short career, I've had the good fortune of working with, I suppose, 2 cohorts of, I think UTS students actually, not trying to blow hot air, but their capacity to interrogate and visualise and express information is inspiring, particularly for someone like myself who's got a pretty basic education in town planning. That I really see the possibility of asking as many questions as we'd like going forward, and having the potential of really exploring those answers I like the idea of everybody be able to engage with that process as well. At the moment, it is very backwards and forwards. Our process is very adversarial, particularly when we're talking with authorities.
It's about who wins the argument. I see great potential through these tools, through that next generation of analysis and skill to open up the conversation in a really meaningful way.
Great, thank you. Elisa, what are you?
Thank you. So it's a really interesting question. I really had to think about it before coming up with an answer, because there are so many things which are the opposite of exciting, or exciting in a not so positive way. In particular, deepfakes were mentioned as one aspect of visualizations. But coming back to the point about what we're trying to achieve, what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve, during my time dealing with data, very often people say it's too hard, we couldn't possibly do it, so we'll keep it simple. And there's another S in there somewhere as well. And that project around out-of-home care, we said we'll build a data set, we'll build life journeys for every single child, we'll map those life journeys against outcomes that we're really genuinely looking to achieve, and we'll follow those life journeys and identify points of friction where children move away or towards the outcomes we're looking for. People literally laughed at the prospect of being able to create those data sets and to understand the life journey of 44,000 children. The complexity that was described in some of the presentations tonight, where you can see not only what's happening now, but also potentially what things might look like, that what-if scenario planning in a realistic, with high fidelity, high granularity, and a really meaningful way, faithful way, I think is really amazingly powerful. So the potential, I think, really exists to take some of the data science, data analytics, machine learning, AI opportunity and say, these are the choices we've got, but this is the entire system we're thinking about. This is the outcome for a community. This is the outcome for a human services area. I think that's really exciting. Being able to deal with that complexity in a way which is manageable for human beings who typically don't manage complexity well.
Yeah, fantastic. Opportunity and challenge. Yeah.
Maybe I just add that visualizations, I think it's really exciting how visualizations can bring out the humanity behind the data. And something that's, we work with frameworks, we don't create the data that is generated by people using the collections, and it's just always really exciting to see what people are interested in, even if I personally don't think that particular topic is interesting, to see it all be revealed. And humans are great, and to have that come out is I think really exciting.
Okay, that's great. I love to hear that the most exciting thing in the field of visualisation is humans. It's so great. Has anyone got the courage up? Yes, Fraser. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, first of all, for the wonderful presentations and so inspiring. I got 2 points out of the presentations. The first one was that we can do so many amazing things with the help of visualization, and it was evident in all the 4 talks that we had. But one thing strikes out for me, and that was the part that you talked about, how visualization can also be misleading. So my question is about where we are actually in terms of ethics in visualization. These are powerful tools. Where we are in terms of what we can do and with these kind of visualization, and making sure that purposefully that kind of misleading information doesn't get conveyed to a large audience. And what kind of strategies or basically guidelines we need to have in place when it comes to visual ethics?
Yeah, fantastic question. Is anyone prepared to jump in on that one?
So ethics is something that New South Wales recently released an AI assurance framework to back up its AI strategy, to back up its AI ethics policy. And we started along that journey taking a very principles-based but somewhat fluffy approach to thinking about ethics. And what we've tried to do is identify what are ethical issues associated with any emergent technology, substitute quantum, substitute anything for dark matter, substitute that. And then, so try to think about an ethical framework that allows us to think about specific issues related to what we are doing versus generic issues related to new technologies. And I appreciate visualization is different. Think about existing applications, emergent applications, and then allow ourselves to think through the consequences of really transformational applications. And that's started to give us a framework to decompose the problem into which bits are, if we're sitting and looking at an AI project and we're uncomfortable with it, and if we take the AI out and we leave the data in, are we still uncomfortable? We take the data out and we're still uncomfortable, then it's not actually an AI or data-driven issue, it's actually an issue about what we're doing. And I think there are some similar principles which might be applied to visualization, where it's separating out those issues which really do relate to the visualization, the way that things are being presented, the balance and some other aspects, and then find a way to decompose in a similar sort of way the bits which are presentation style, the bits which we know relate to optical illusions, and then get down to what are the principles that we should put in place if we're trying to tell an unbiased story, or if we're trying to tell a balanced story, if we're trying to tell a story where we're saying much more is, not why, or an inferred why.
I suppose I'll jump in and continue from Ian's point there, that it's great to hear that there are, I suppose, those checks and balances being put in place somewhere, because I suppose within the property industry and within strategic planning, they aren't there. That the visualization, if you go back to my very crude title for my opening slides about sex slides and photo montages, there is a skepticism that the visualizing the outcome is often met with, I suppose, a sense of dread or mistrust. And that's whether we're talking about an individual project, a building, its impact, view affectation. But if you take that same scepticism and apply it to strategic planning about the investment of $10 billion in a new metro scheme and the use of data sources to justify population forecast or a particular alignment or government acquisition, I suppose the question is that, like, what is the oversight? Who is capable of interrogating that data? And I'd say very, very few, and often those consultants are all working on the same team. So I think there is a real concern about how we use data and how we visualise it and then use that as part of a decision-making framework, particularly when government money is being spent. I don't want to wade into anything too dodgy here, but I think that this is the way the industry is going, that we are grappling with how we use data to inform the decisions that we're making, particularly around infrastructure. So I think the type of oversight and the type of ethics framework should absolutely be applied across the board.
Elisa, Michela? No? All right. Is there any other questions from the audience? Yes, Ian.
Thank you. So we've been looking at, for quite a few years now, the visualization of data and the power of the visualization of data. What role, moving forward, does narrative, or can narrative and storytelling have? We've touched a little bit on that in the previous question. It's easy to then distort the data through storytelling, but I think in terms of communicating to a mass audience, there's incredible potential to persuade and influence as well. So what do you see moving forward is the role for narrative and storytelling in this, the realm of visualization and data visualization?
Yeah, it's a big question, Ian. I mean, for me, I talked a bit about tools, and because for me, the approach that I'm really passionate about at the moment is the idea that certainly interactive data visualization tools allow the user to tell their story. And obviously there's a long tradition of linear storytelling where the narrative is pre-written, fleshed out with the data. But for me, the real opportunity with the world we're in now, you only have to look at the social media influencers who react to things. We did a project a few months ago. I said, what do you do? And the guy said, I'm a reactor. And I didn't even know what the term reactor meant. And it's okay, now I do. I hope you all do too as well. But the idea that people could be using a tool and then the story is basically their reaction, their personal reaction to the data, I think for better or for worse, that is the world we're in today. And I think anyone working with data sets has to acknowledge that a preset, pre-packaged narrative isn't necessarily going to cut it, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll jump in again. Storytelling is really what we do for our clients. So we are trying to sell a dream, where it is the dream of a private developer or government, like I said before. And I think where we have struggled, and I hope I highlighted in my presentation, that we do grapple with how we express the outcomes of our data analysis. There's often a case of, wow, look what we've been able to produce, followed up with a so what. How does that tie into the future of a place, the future of the city? How does it get people engaged? And unfortunately, we don't often have enough time to spend on creating that narrative. Or if we do, the outcome of our research, the outcome of that data analysis is dropped because it is too difficult to engage with. And so you end up back with this qualitative outcome which lacks the substance to back up your arguments. Or you fall into a trap of pursuing a data-driven outcome and people glaze over, because particularly when we're engaging with the broader public, whether it be strategic planning or talking about the future of a town centre, if you can't engage them in a compelling narrative, then forget it. And that's where we are, trying to bring those two elements together. So I'm hoping, certainly within the next 5-10 years, that we're going to get a lot better if the last 10 years is anything to go by.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anyone else like to, Elisa?
Maybe you could add that when, I guess, through the project that we're working with collection visualisation, is that when it's shown in a public space, rather than us telling a narrative, it's revealing other people's narratives. And one thing that works really well about the public space is that it promotes conversation. And when there's people standing around, I had a lady who was just staring at the screen and she said, I got married there. And she didn't know me, I didn't know her, but she just started to tell me about her life. And there's lots of examples of that where in a public space, people seem more willing, when mediated through another experience, to share their own stories. And so I guess, using visualisation to inspire others to tell their own narratives. Yeah.
I can't help myself.
Go for it.
We are, as a species, a pattern-seeking, storytelling species. And in fact, ultimately, the only thing we ever really listen to are stories. Way back when the Data Analytics Centre was created, we had originally no budget, no team, no data scientists, but we had 10 problems given to us by New South Wales government to look at, including out-of-home care. The minister I report into gave up his speaking spot in cabinet for me to go in there and essentially pitch the case to fund the Data Analytics Centre, and it wasn't a small amount of money. And I'd learnt some time ago that if it's really important, you have to tell a story. That's the only option you've got. I walked in, Premier Baird at the time said, okay, you've got 5 minutes, tell us why we should fund you. So I started telling stories, and 30 minutes later I was still telling stories. And at some point someone said, we have to stop this, we have to move on with the other business of government. And then the minister who'd given up his speaking slot said, tell them about this particular project. And I said, are you sure? He said, tell them about that project. I said, are you really sure? The minister responsible is right in front of me. He said, tell them the story. So I started telling them about this particular story where we'd found a lot of really, really bad behaviour. The minister went ballistic, absolutely exploded in front of me and said, why don't I, fill in your favourite expletive, understand this? Why don't I know this from my own staff? We got the money. That was great. Ruined the relationship with that department for years to come. But ultimately, if it's really important, you tell a story. And that leads to a really significant problem, similar to that question about the ethics of visualisation, which is the ethics of storytelling. If you've led someone on a path on a certain point, relying on facts and figures and statistics and insights, and then take that last step and say, and this is my interpretation, this is my why, as opposed to saying this is my is, then I think we do really face a moral, ethical dilemma. And I'm a really big fan of standards, so I think there should actually be standards for visualisation that we need to adhere to. I think there should be standards for storytelling that we should adhere to. There is a standard for making a cup of tea, by the way, international standard. It's milk first, for those who are going to be shocked by that. There's a spoiler. I think we should have a standard for storytelling.
Great, thank you, Ian. And speaking of tea, I think it unfortunately is time for us to wrap up this part of the evening. I know there are other questions in the audience that I can see people are keen to ask, so there will be a chance now for everyone to mingle and approach the panellists and ask those questions in person. I would just like to thank once again our panellists for amazing presentations and very thoughtful and considered responses to those questions. So thank you for giving up your time and energy to be with us tonight. So please join me in thanking our panellists. Did you want to come up and join, Linda? I think, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, no, thank you all for coming. It's been really interesting, and particularly because such a diverse range of projects and speakers, and it just goes to show what we can do in the future all together, certainly in this medium. So very exciting. Don't forget we have a symposium tomorrow as well, so many more projects and many more opportunities to engage with people all day tomorrow over the road in Building 11.
Yep.
So we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Yes, yeah, not too late to register if you haven't already. Symposium 10 till 5 tomorrow. I would also just like to say a very quick thank you to all the Visualisation Institute executive people and volunteers who have helped us put today together. We've put together, I think we've planned 2 prior launch events that were happening in 2020 and 2021. So it's good to finally get an in-person event, to have you all here. But thanks everyone for putting the effort into the UTS events team for making it all possible. I think that's everything I had on my list. Please give yourselves a big hand and then go over, have some food, have some drink, hang around and have a chat. All right, thanks everyone.